Have you ever wondered how much your memories are actually worth? Not the sentimental value we carry in our hearts, but the physical weight of a life lived. The dusty photo albums, the hand carved cedar chest, the letters written in ink that has faded to a ghostly gray. Now, imagine coming home after a month of breathing in the salty air of the Mediterranean, feeling lighter than you have in decades, only to find that your entire history has been erased. Not by a fire, not by a thief in the night, but by the very people you brought into this world. What if the people you trust most decided that you were already a ghost while your heart was still beating? What if they didn't just want your future, but they decided to auction off your past? This isn't just a story about a burglary, it's a story about the ultimate betrayal, the kind that leaves a hollow ache in your chest where your home used to be.
Elaine stood on her driveway, the wheels of her suitcase clicking rhythmically against the concrete sound that usually signaled the comfort of a journey's end. After 35 years of boisterous teenagers and meticulously filing the wisdom of the world in the oak-paneled quiet of the city library, she had finally retired. Her husband Arthur had been gone for 5 years, and the silence of their house had slowly shifted from a suffocating shroud to a peaceful companion. She had spent 14 days watching the sunset over the Aegean Sea, finally feeling like she was more than just Arthur's widow or the kid's mother. She was Elaine, and Elaine was finally free. But as she reached for her house keys, she noticed something chillingly wrong. The heavy brass planter that usually sat by the door, the one Arthur had bought her for their 25th anniversary, was gone. There was only a pale, circular patch on the porch where the sun hadn't reached. The wood, the air around her seemed too thin. A strange, metallic taste filled her mouth, the taste of sudden, inexplicable fear. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking so violently the keys chimed like a warning bell. When the door finally swung open, the scent didn't greet her with the familiar notes of lavender, sachets, and old paper. It smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and nothingness. The foyer was a skeleton, the mahogany console table where she kept her mail, gone, the vintage mirror that captured the morning light, gone. She stepped into the living room, her breath hitching in a series of jagged gasps. The walls were bare, the shadows of picture frames etched into the paint like the outlines of victims at a crime scene. Her sofas, her rugs, the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that held the curated soul of her life, full vanished. Arthish, we whispered, the name slipping out before she remembered he wasn't there to protect her. She felt a wave of vertigo. Had she been robbed? But the house was cleaned. There were no broken windows, no splintered wood. It wasn't a ransacking. It was an extraction. With a heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she rushed to the back bedroom, her sanctuary. This was where she kept the storage bins, the overflow of a life well lived, the bins containing Arthur's old sweaters that still carried the faint scent of pipe tobacco, her children's first drawings, the delicate porcelain dolls she'd inherited from her grandmother. She threw open the closet doors. Empty, even, the hangers were gone. Just as the first sob threatened to tear its way out of her throat, her phone buzzed in her pocket. There was a text in the family group chat. Her daughter, Julianne, age 39, had posted a photo of a high-end espresso machine, sold the old espresso maker for $200, adding it to the new chapter fund. Mom's going to be so happy when she sees how much space we've cleared for her. A second later, her son, Mark, 36, replied, told you that vintage rug would go fast. Guy picked it up an hour ago. We're nearly done with the storage unit, too. Honestly, why did she keep all that junk? It's a literal weight off her shoulders. Elaine stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in eyes that were rapidly filling with tears of pure, unadulterated shock. They weren't mourning a theft. They were celebrating a liquidation. Her children, the ones she had stayed up with through fevers, the ones she had put through college by skipping vacations and wearing the same winter coat for a decade, had spent her vacation dismantling her life. They hadn't waited for her to pass away to start fighting over the spoils. They had simply decided she was finished with them. They called it decluttering. They called it a new chapter. But as Elaine stood in the echoing silence of her hollowed home, she knew exactly what it was. A declaration that she was no longer the master of her own existence. She walked to the kitchen, or what was left of it. The breakfast nook was gone. In its place stood a single, cheap folding chair that hadn't been there before. On it sat a note in Julienne's neat, aggressive cursive. "Welcome home, Mom. We decided to give you the best retirement gift ever, minimalism. We've sold the heavy stuff and put the money into a high-yield account for your future care. No more dusting old relics. Let's start fresh. Dinner at my place at 6. Elaine felt a coldness settle over her, not the cold of the air conditioner, but a deep, crystalline shift in her very marrow. The future care fund. They weren't just clearing out her furniture, they were preparing her for a cage. They were already spending her life's equity while she was still standing on it. She looked at the blank walls, the spots where memories used to hang, and for the first time in 67 years, Elaine didn't feel like a mother or a librarian. She felt like a ghost. But as she sat on that solitary folding chair, her tears dried. A new sensation began to flicker in the pit of her stomach, a spark of something sharp, calculated, and dangerously quiet. If they thought she was ready to be packed away into a minimalist life, they had forgotten one thing. She had spent her life organizing information. She knew where all the records were kept, and she knew exactly how to rewrite the ending of this story. Elaine didn't go to dinner at Julienne's that night. She didn't call to scream, and she didn't send a flurry of panicked texts. Instead, she sat in the dark on that plastic folding chair, watching the moonlight move across the scarred hardwood floors. The silence, which had once been her friend, now felt like a witness. She realized then that her children hadn't just sold her belongings. They had performed a psychological autopsy on her while she was still alive. They had looked at her treasures, physical manifestations of her love, her travel, and her marriage, and seen nothing but clutter and resale value. The betrayal wasn't just in the loss of the items. It was in the terrifying realization that to Julianne and Mark, Elaine was no longer a person. She was a pre-dash estate. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, Elaine stood up. Her joints ached, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. She walked to the one place they hadn't touched, a small, loose floorboard beneath the master bedroom closet. It was an old-fashioned hiding spot Arthur had built for their mad money and important documents. She pried it up with a kitchen knife. Inside, her passport, her birth certificate, and the deed to the house remained. They hadn't found it because they hadn't looked for her soul. They had only looked for things with a barcode or a brand name. She opened her laptop, the one piece of technology they had spared, likely because it was too old to fetch a decent price on Facebook Marketplace. With trembling fingers, she logged into her bank accounts. She saw the high-yield account Julianne had mentioned. It was a joint account, her daughter's name sitting right next to hers like a predator waiting for a meal. The balance was $42,000. That was the price of her life. $42,000 for 35 years of history. Her heart hammered. They were already moving the money around, treating her savings like a communal pot. "Is this what I am to you?" she whispered to the empty room, an inconvenience to be managed. The memory of Julianne and Mark's childhood flashed through her mind, the late-night visits, the way she had worked double shifts at the library to ensure they graduated debt-free, the way she had mediated their petty squabbles for 3 decades. She had been their safety net for so long that they had forgotten she was also a human being, with the right to her own gravity. They didn't see a mother. They saw a bank that was taking too long to close. By 8 a.m., Elaine was at the bank. She didn't go to her usual branch where the tellers knew her children. She went to the main headquarters downtown. She withdrew every cent from the joint account, moving it into a private trust they couldn't touch. Then, she visited her lawyer, a man named Marcus, who had been a dear friend of Arthur's. "Elaine, you look like you've seen a ghost," Marcus said, pulling out a chair for her in his wood-paneled office. "I haven't seen one, Marcus," she replied, her voice steady and low. "I've become one. And now, I need you to help me vanish." For the next 3 hours, they worked in a fever of legal documents and red ink. She didn't just want to protect her money. She wanted to reclaim her agency. She instructed Marcus to put the house on the Marquetta pocket listing. Quiet and fast. She didn't care about getting top dollar. She cared about getting out. Next, she drafted a new will. The previous version had left everything: the house, the retirement funds, the life insurance, to be split 50-50 between Julianne and Mark. As she watched Marcus strike through their names, she felt a strange, cold shiver of liberation. Are you sure about this? Marcus asked, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. This is scorched earth, Elaine. They scorched the earth the moment they sold my mother's porcelain dolls to a stranger for $20, she said. They didn't just take my things, Marcus. They took my dignity. They want me to be a minimalist. Fine, I'll start with a life that doesn't include them. She left the office with a heavy envelope and a sense of purpose. She spent the next 48 hours in a whirlwind of motion. She booked a one-way ticket to a small coastal town in Oregon a place Arthur had always talked about visiting, but they never did. She rented a small, furnished cottage overlooking the cliffs. It was tiny, beautiful, and most importantly, anonymous. She didn't pack a suitcase. There was nothing left to pack. She bought a new wardrobe, a new phone, and a new life. On her final night in the house, she stood in the center of the vacant living room. The echo of her footsteps was the only sound. She felt a brief, stabbing pang of grief, not for the furniture, but for the children she thought she had raised. She had raised them to be ambitious, yes, but she had failed to see when that ambition turned into a cold, calculating greed. She had loved them too much to see they were capable of this. She pulled out 2 envelopes. One was addressed to Julianne, the other to Mark. Inside was not a long, tearful explanation. There were no pleas for forgiveness or demands for an apology. There was simply a copy of the receipt from the Hyel account showing a balance of 0 and a short, typed note. You wanted to declutter my life? I've finished the job for you. Don't look for me. I'm finally living the new chapter you were so excited about. She left the notes on the kitchen counter, right next to the cheap folding chair. She walked out the front door, locked it, and dropped the key into the sewer grate at the end of the driveway. As she drove toward the airport, the sun began to rise, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. For the first time in years, Elaine didn't feel like a librarian, a widow, or a mother. She felt like a woman with a secret. And a woman with a secret is a dangerous thing. She boarded the plane without looking back. She didn't check her phone when it started blowing up an hour later. She didn't answer when the caller ID showed Julianne's face, likely distorted with the realization that the Future Care Fund was gone. She simply turned the device off, leaned her head against the window, and watched the clouds. She was 67 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was completely, utterly alone. And to her surprise, it felt like victory. But the story didn't end with a flight to Oregon. Justice, real justice, is a slow-cooked meal, and Elaine was a very patient woman. The small cottage in Oregon smelled of salt air and fresh pine, a stark contrast to the sterile, hollowed-out silence of the home she had left behind. Elaine spent her first few months in a state of suspended animation. She watched the great Pacific waves crash against the jagged rocks, the mist clinging to the windows like a shroud. She was reinventing herself in the quiet. She became the woman who walked the beach at dawn, the woman who sat in the local cafe reading poetry, the woman who no one knew was a retired librarian from the suburbs. To the locals, she was just Elaine, a soft-spoken newcomer with eyes that seemed to see right through you. Back in her old world, the storm was raging. Through Marcus, her attorney, she received filtered updates. The house had sold within 2 weeks. A cash buyer, quick and final. When Julianne and Mark realized the house was gone, they had reportedly lost their minds. They had shown up at the property only to find a sold sign and a locksmith changing the tumblers. They had called the police, claiming their mother had been kidnapped or was suffering from a mental breakdown. But Marcus had stepped in with the power of attorney documents and the video recording of their final meeting. He had calmly informed the authorities and the children that Elaine was perfectly sane, perfectly safe, and perfectly done with them. They're asking for your address, Elaine, Marcus told her over a secure line 6 months later. Julianne is claiming she needs to return some items she found in her garage. Mark is mentioning something about a misunderstanding regarding the bank account. They sound ... desperate. Elaine looked at the small, hand-painted ceramic bowl she had bought at a local fair. The only thing on her mantel. The only thing they are desperate for, Marcus, is the inheritance they think they've lost. Tell them the items can be donated to a shelter. As for the address, tell them I've moved to the one place they can't reach. The present. The years. began to stack up like well-ordered books on a shelf. 1 year turned into 3, then 5. Elaine's life in Oregon was modest but rich. She volunteered at the local literacy center, teaching adults to read, a task that brought her more fulfillment than 30 years of filing ever had. She lived off her retirement and the proceeds from the house sale. But she lived simply. She didn't buy a new mahogany table or vintage rugs. She didn't want to own anything that could be sold behind her back ever again. During this time, her children's lives began to unravel in the way that lives built on entitlement often do. Without the safety net of their mother's house and savings, the cracks in their own foundations widened. Julianne's marriage, already strained by the pursuit of a lifestyle she couldn't afford, collapsed under the weight of debt. Mark, who had always relied on loans from his mother to float his failing tech startups, found himself facing bankruptcy. They had spent their lives looking at their mother as a resource, a mine to be stripped of its minerals, and now that the mine was closed, they were starving. They tried everything to find her. They hired a Laurent private investigator. But Elaine had been a librarian. She knew how to bury a trail better than most. She had moved her assets into a complex trust, changed her legal last name to her mother's maiden name, and stayed off social media entirely. To the digital world, Elaine had ceased to exist the moment she stepped onto that plane. But Elaine wasn't just hiding. She was building something. Every month, she met with a financial advisor and Marcus Till. The money from the house sale, the high-yield money she had reclaimed, and the life insurance from Martha had been invested with a singular, cold purpose. She wasn't spending it on herself. She was growing it. She was cultivating a garden of justice that would only bloom when she was no longer there to see it. She often thought about the clutter they had sold. She missed the cedar chest. She missed Arthur's sweaters. But the loss had given her a strange kind of superpower. She was no longer afraid of losing anything. When you have already lost your past, the future becomes a blank page you can write on with permanent ink. She began to draft the final document, one that would be the ultimate pattern interrupter for her children's greed. One evening, as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the Oregon sky in a deep, bloody crimson, she felt a familiar pang in her chest, not of grief, but of finality. Her doctor had told her that her heart, while strong in spirit, was tired. She had a year, maybe 2. She didn't feel afraid. She felt a sense of immense, quiet excitement. The trap was set. The story was written. All that was left was the final chapter. She sat down at her small desk and wrote 2 last letters. These wouldn't be sent until the very end. They weren't letters of reconciliation. They were the keys to a vault that Julianne and Mark would never be able to open. "Do you think they'll understand?" Marcus asked her during their final Zoom call, his hair much whiter than it had been years ago. "Oh, they'll understand perfectly," Elaine said, a small, sharp smile playing on her lips. "Greed is a very effective translator. They'll see exactly what they traded for a few $1,000s in a minimalist house. They'll see the cost of a mother's soul." The end came as quietly as a falling leaf on a windless day. Elaine passed away in her sleep, overlooking the ocean. She had come to love more than the home that had betrayed her. She left behind no clutter, no dusty boxers, and no unwashed dishes. Her life in Oregon was a masterpiece of precision. When the news reached Julianne and Mark, it didn't come from a grieving friend or a frantic hospital call. It came via a formal, cold email from the law offices of Marcuson's associates. For the siblings, the news of their mother's death was instantly eclipsed by a frantic, cloying anticipation. This was the moment they had been waiting for since they watched her cruise ship leave the harbor years ago. The payday. They met in Marcus's high-rise office, dressed in black, not out of mourning, but because it felt like the appropriate uniform for a transaction. They hadn't seen each other in months, their relationship having soured as they blamed each other for losing their mother and her money. "I hope she didn't spend it all on that little shack in the woods," Julianne whispered, her eyes darting around the expensive office. Mark hissed back. "The house alone was worth nearly $1 million. Plus Dad's insurance. It's there. It has to be." Marcus entered the room, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He didn't offer condolences. He knew they would be wasted. He placed a thick, leather-bound folder on the desk and sat down. "Elaine was a very meticulous woman," Marcus began, his voice echoing in the sterile room. She spent her final years ensuring that her legacy was handled with the same care she once gave to the rare books in her library. Before we get to the distribution of assets, she requested that I read this final statement to you both. Julianne leaned forward, her knuckles white. Mark tapped a restless rhythm on his knee. Marcus opened a letter and read, "To Julianne and Mark, you once told me that you wanted to declutter my life so I could start a new chapter. I want to thank you for that. Without your intervention, I might never have realized that the things I owned were holding me back from seeing who you truly were. You taught me that memories aren't in objects, they are in the respect we show the living. Because you were so eager to manage my future care and my estate while I was still breathing, I decided to save you the trouble of waiting until I was gone." A cold sweat broke out on Mark's forehead. What does that mean? Marcus continued reading, ignoring the interruption. "I have spent the last several years building something that will last much longer than a vintage rug or a cedar chest. I have established the Arthur and Elaine Vance Literacy Foundation. Its mission is to provide books and education to children who have nothing, children who will learn to value the stories of those who came before them. The money," Marcus, Julianne snapped, her voice trembling. "Where is the money?" Marcus turned the page of the legal document. "The total value of the estate, including the investments grown over the last few years, the sale of the primary residence, and the liquidated retirement funds, amounts to approximately $2.4 million. Julianne gasped, a triumphant smile momentarily breaking through her mask. $2 million. However, Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, per the instructions of the irrevocable trust, the entirety of those funds, every single cent, has been transferred to the foundation. The trust was finalized 48 hours before her passing." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. "Everything," Mark choked out. "She left us. Nothing." "Not quite," Marcus said. He reached into the folder and pulled out 2 small, identical envelopes. He slid them across the mahogany table. "She left you these." With trembling hands, they tore them open. There were no checks, no deed to a hidden property. Inside each envelope was a single, glossy photograph. Julianne's photo was of the brass planter that had sat on their childhood porch. On the back, in Elaine's steady hand, was written, "Sold for $45 at a yard sale. Price of a mother's welcome." Mark's photo was of Arthur's old cedar chest, the one that had held his father's history. On the back it read, "Sold for $120 on Marketplace. Price of a father's legacy." Attached to the photos was a final receipt, a copy of the donation tax credit for $2.4 million, made out in the name of a woman they had treated as a ghost long before she died. "She wanted you to have them. Minimalism you were so fond of," Marcus said, standing up and closing the folder with a definitive thud. "The estate is settled. You are free of the clutter of her life forever." As they sat in the plush chairs of the office, surrounded by the wealth they would never touch, the poetic justice of it settled over them like a shroud. They had sold her past for pennies, so she had sold their future for a purpose. Elaine was gone, but her story was finally perfectly organized. The first winter in Oregon wasn't just cold. It was a physical manifestation of the wall Elaine had built between her past and her present. In her old life, winter meant decorating the large mahogany table, the one Julianne had sold to a stranger for $300, with evergreen boughs and candles. Now, Elaine sat by a small, efficient wood-burning stove in her cottage, clutching a mug of tea with both hands. She realized that for decades she had been the keeper of things. She had been the curator of a museum dedicated to her family, and her children had been the vandals who realized the museum was worth more as scrap metal. But the silence of the cottage was often interrupted by the ghost of her phone. Even though she had changed her number, the phantom vibration in her pocket persisted, a psychological remnant of 30 years of being on call for Mark's financial crises and Julianne's emotional outbursts. One evening, while looking through a local newspaper, she saw a small human interest story about a local library facing budget cuts. It was like a spark hitting dry kindling. She didn't just want to hide, she wanted to build. But to build her foundation of justice, she had to ensure her children couldn't find her before the legal concrete had dried. Meanwhile, back in the suburbs, the atmosphere in Julianne's pristine, minimalist home was curdling. Julianne sat in her designer kitchen, staring at the empty space where her mother used to sit during Sunday dinners. She wasn't staring because she missed Elaine's laughter. She was staring because the future care fund was sitting at a zero balance, and the mortgage on her own house was 3 months in arrears. She has to be somewhere, Mark, Julianne hissed into her phone, her voice echoing off the bare walls she had so proudly curated. People don't just evaporate at 6. She's got the house money. She's got Dad's pension. She's probably sitting on a beach somewhere laughing at us. I checked the airports, Jules. Mark's voice crackled on the other end, sounding thin and stressed. Nothing. It's like she used her librarian skills to redact herself from the world. And the lawyer, that shark Marcus, won't even take my calls anymore. He just sends an automated email saying the client's wishes are being upheld. About our wishes. We did that for her. We cleared that house so she wouldn't have to deal with the stress. The irony was a bitter pill that neither of them was willing to swallow. They had convinced themselves of their own lie that the sale of Elaine's belongings was an act of mercy rather than a heist. In Oregon, Elaine began her first move. She didn't go to a big bank. She went to a small, local credit union and met with a woman named Sarah. I want to start a private trust, Elaine said, her voice sounding stronger than it had in months. But I want it structured in layers. I want the beneficiaries to be invisible until a specific triggering event. Sarah looked at the soft-spoken woman across from her. And what is the triggering event, Mrs. Vance? Elaine looked out the window at the gray horizon. My final breath. I want the money to work for the world, but I want it to serve as a mirror for my children. I want them to see exactly what they valued and what they lost. Over the next few weeks, Elaine began a correspondence with Marcus that was coded and cautious. She began to learn the true depth of her children's entitlement. Mark had tried to file a missing persons report, claiming Elaine was mentally unfit and had been coerced into selling her home. When Marcus told her this, Elaine didn't cry. She felt a cold, sharp click in her mind, like a lock falling into place. They aren't looking for a mother, she wrote back to Marcus. They are looking for a lost wallet. Let them keep looking. It's time to move the pieces on the board. She instructed Marcus to release a small breadcrumb, a tip to a private investigator she knew Mark had hired. The tip suggested she had moved to Arizona. It was a classic librarian's trick, misdirection through a false trail of records. While Mark and Julianne spent their dwindling savings flying to Phoenix and scouring retirement communities in the desert heat, Elaine was quietly buying a small plot of land in Oregon under a corporate name, the Cedar Chest Holdings. Every time she signed that name, she felt a surge of adrenaline. The Cedar Chest was gone, but the power it represented, the weight of her history, was being transformed into a weapon of absolute truth. She began to spend her afternoons at the local literacy center. There, she met a young man named Leo. Leo was 24, a high school dropout who had spent his life being told he was clutter in the system. He wanted to learn to read so he could understand his grandfather's old journals. As Elaine sat with Leo, pointing to letters and forming sounds, she felt a warmth that Julianne and Mark had never provided. Leo treated the books with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. He turned the pages as if they were made of gold leaf. Why do you care so much about these old things, Leo? Elaine asked one day. Leo looked at her, his eyes serious. Because, if I don't know where I came from, how am I supposed to know where I'm going? These books are the only thing that stays when the people leave. Elaine felt a lump in her throat. Her own children had sold her books for 50 cents a box. And here was a stranger, fighting to earn the right to read them. It was in that moment that the Arthur and Elaine Vance Literacy Foundation transitioned from a plan of revenge to a plan of purpose. She realized that the best way to punish her children wasn't just to take the money away. It was to give it to people who actually deserved the legacy they had thrown in the trash, while Mark and Julianne were chasing ghosts in the Arizona heat, sweating through expensive linen shirts they couldn't afford to dry clean anymore. Elaine was becoming a ghost of a different kind. She had started to enjoy the anonymity of her new life in the Pacific Northwest. In her old town, she was a librarian, a fixture of the community who people spoke to out of habit. In Oregon, she was just a woman with a sharp mind and a weathered face, a woman who knew how to listen. She spent her mornings watching the fog roll off the ocean, thick and white like the vellum paper of the ancient manuscripts she used to handle. She began to keep a journal not for herself, but for the record. She wrote about the weight of the cedar chest, the way Arthur's sweaters felt against her cheek, and the specific, gut-wrenching moment she realized her children had walked through her home like it was an estate sale before she was even cold. She was documenting the betrayal, not out of bitterness, but because a librarian knows that without a record, the truth can be rewritten. And she was going to make sure the truth was written in stone. Back in the suburbs, the pressure was reaching a breaking point. Julienne's minimalist lifestyle was no longer a choice, it was becoming a necessity. She had sold her SUV to cover 2 months of mortgage payments, convincing her friends she was going green. But behind closed doors, she was spiraling. She sat at her kitchen island, the one she had bought with the money from her mother's antique dining set, and stared at a stack of pastel notices. "She's doing this on purpose," Julianne whispered to the empty room. She picked up her phone and dialed Mark for the 10th time that day. "Mark," the investigator called. He said the lead in Phoenix was a dead end. Someone used Mom's social security number to rent a car, but the signature didn't match. It was a decoy. "Mark, she's playing us." Mark's voice sounded muffled, as if he were hiding in a closet. "I can't talk right now. Joe's board of the startup is meeting. If I don't show them a liquidity bridge by Friday, they're ousting me. I told them my inheritance was tied up in probate. If they find out there is no probate, I'm finished." "You lied to your board?" Julianne gasped. "We both lied, Julianne. We told the world we were helping Mom move into a luxury assisted living. The Silanumi told everyone the house sale was for her benefit. Now she's vanished with the cash, and we look like ... lied. Like what we are," Julianne finished, her voice cold. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that they had gambled on their mother's passivity and lost. They had assumed Elaine was a static object, a piece of furniture that would stay where they hadn't realized that for 35 years, Elaine hadn't just been filing books. She had been studying the human condition. She knew their weaknesses better than they knew themselves. She knew Julianne's vanity and Mark's desperation, and she was using those very traits to keep them running in circles while she built her fortress. In Oregon, Elaine's work with Leo was progressing. One rainy Tuesday, Leo walked into the literacy center with a grin that split his face. He held up a crumpled piece of paper, a letter from his daughter's school. "I read it, Elaine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I read the whole thing. I didn't need the text-to-speech app. I knew what the teacher was saying about my girl." Elaine felt a surge of pride that was sharper and cleaner than any she had felt for her own children in years. With Julianne and Mark, every achievement had felt like a transaction, a request for a reward, a demand for more. With Leo, it was pure. She realized then that legacy isn't about blood. It's about who carries your light when you're gone. "Leo," Elaine said softly, "how would you like to help me with a project? I'm starting a foundation. We need people who understand that a book is more than just paper and ink. We need people who know that a story can save a life." "I'm in," Leo said without hesitation. "Whatever you need." Elaine began to use Leah as her boots on the ground. Under her direction, he began to look into small, struggling libraries across the state. She wasn't just going to give the money away. She was going to create a network of sanctuaries, places where history was protected, where the clutter of the past was treated with the respect it deserved. She also began a more dangerous game. She instructed Marcus to send a very specific letter to Julianne and Mark. It wasn't a letter from her, but a formal notice from an anonymous third-party trust, stating that a significant portion of the Vance estate was being held in escrow, pending verification of the heir's conduct. It was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. It gave them just enough hope to keep them from giving up, but it required them to prove they were caring children. Suddenly, the tone of the voicemails changed. Julianne began leaving messages on Elaine's old, disconnected number, her voice dripping with performative sweetness. "Mom, if you can hear this, we're so worried. We didn't mean to upset you. We just wanted you to be free of the house. We've even kept some of your things in storage. ... We want to give them back." Elaine listened to these recordings through a digital service Marcus had set up. She sat in her small kitchen, listening to her daughter lie with the practiced ease of a professional. Julianne hadn't kept anything. Elaine knew for a fact that the storage unit had been emptied and the contents sold to a junkout company for $300. "You're still trying to sell me a story." "Julianne," Elaine whispered to the recording, "but I'm the one holding the pen now." As the second year of her disappearance drew to a close, Elaine's health began to flicker. The salt air was good for her soul, but her heart was tired. She began to spend more time in the lawyer's office, finalizing the trigger clauses. She wanted to make sure that when the truth finally hit her children, it wouldn't just be a financial blow, it would be a moral reckoning. She had Marcus set up a digital time capsule. It was a series of videos she recorded in the quiet of her cottage. In them, she didn't scream or cry. She spoke calmly about the history of the objects they had sold. She told the story of the brass planter, how she and Arthur had hauled it home in the rain, laughing the whole way. She told the story of the cedar chest, how it had been a wedding gift from a father who had nothing else to give. "I want them to watch these," Elaine told Marcus. "I want them to have to sit through every single memory they sold. I want them to know the exact price of their greed." "Elaine, it's intense," Marcus said, looking at the frail woman on his screen. "It's justice, Marcus. See, they wanted a life without clutter. I'm going to give it to them. A life entirely empty of the people who loved them." The third year of Elaine's absence was the year the masks finally shattered. In the affluent suburbs where Elaine had once been a pillar of the community, the gossip had turned from curiosity to a sharp, jagged judgment. Julianne and Mark were no longer the devoted children helping their mother downsize. They were the siblings whose mother had preferred to vanish into the thin air of the world rather than spend another day in their presence. Julianne's desperation had reached a fever pitch. Her house, the minimalist monument she had built on the bones of her mother's memories, was now under a foreclosure notice. She had spent the last of her credit on a second private investigator, a man named Miller, who didn't care about ethics, only about the wire transfer. "I found something," Miller said, tossing a grainy photo onto Julianne's marble countertop. "It's a corporate filing for something called the Cedar Chest Holdings in a small town in Oregon. The signatory is a local kid, but the funding, it's coming from a blind trust managed by a guy named Marcus in your hometown." Julianne's heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. With the Cedar Chest, the name was a taunt. It was a direct slap in the face. "She's there," Julianne whispered, her eyes narrowing. "She's been building something without us." She called Mark. He was in a worse state. His startup had folded, and he was facing a series of lawsuits from investors who felt they had been misled about his impending inheritance. When Julianne told him about Oregon, he didn't feel relief. He felt a surge of predatory hope. "If she's buying land, Jules, she's still got the millions," Mark rasped. "We need to go there, not to apologize. We need to go there with a doctor. If we can prove she's been unstable buying random land under fake names, we can contest the trust. We can get an emergency conservatorship. We can bring her back and put her in a facility where she can't spend another dime of our money." Our money. The phrase hung in the air, a testament to their absolute lack of remorse. They packed their bags, not with gifts or olive branches, but with legal documents and the names of high-priced psychiatrists. They were going to save their mother, even if it meant destroying the last shred of her spirit. Little did they know, Elaine was waiting for them. She had seen the inquiries into the Cedar Chest holdings. She knew Miller had been poking around. She sat in her cottage, her breath coming in shorter, shallower bursts now, but her mind was a steel trap. She had already arranged the final stage with Leo and Marcus. "They're coming, aren't they?" Leo asked one afternoon, looking at the two dark SUVs that had been seen circling the town. "Let them come," Elaine said, her voice a ghost of its former self but filled with a terrifying clarity. "The library is ready, the foundation is locked, and the cameras are rolling." She had turned the cottage into a stage. Small, high-definition cameras were hidden in the rafters, part of the security system she had installed for the trust. This wasn't just for her safety, it was the final piece of the digital time capsule. She wanted the world and the legal board of the foundation to see exactly what happened when the loving children finally caught up with their prey. On a Tuesday afternoon, the salt spray thick in the air, there was a heavy, authoritative knock on the cottage door. Elaine didn't gear up. She stayed in her chair, the one overlooking the sea. The door burst open. Julianne and Mark rushed in, followed by a man in a sharp suit holding a briefcase. They expected to find a woman who was confused, perhaps disheveled, someone they could easily paint as diminished. Instead, They found Elaine. She looked frail, yes, her hair was a shock of white, and her skin was like fine parchment. But her eyes, those librarian eyes that had seen 1,000 stories, were as sharp as diamonds. You're late, Elaine said, not turning around. I expected you 3 months ago. Did the Arizona heat slow you down? Mom, Julianne cried, her voice a masterclass in fake concern. Oh, thank God. We've been looking everywhere. You're not well. Look at this place. It's tiny. It's not safe. We have a medical transport waiting. We're taking you home. Home. Elaine turned her chair slowly. You sold home, Julianne. You sold the walls, the floorboards, and the memories. There is no home to go back to. We did that for you, Mark shouted, his composure breaking as he looked at the modest. We did it so you wouldn't have to worry. And then you steal the money. You move to the middle of nowhere and start buying land like a crazy person. We have a court order, Mom. We're here to take care of you, whether you like it or not. Elaine looked at the man with the briefcase, the psychiatrist they had hired to evaluate her on the spot. And are you here to tell me I've lost my mind because I chose to spend my own money on things that matter? Mrs. Vance, the doctor started. Your children are concerned about your unconventional choices. Elaine laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. My choices are only unconventional to those who think a mother is a bank. Julianne, Mark, ... Look at me. Truly look at me for the first time in your lives. She stood up, leaning heavily on her cane. You think you've caught me? You think you're going to take me back to a room and wait for me to die so you can finally get your hands on the clutter of my life? But I have a surprise for you. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a remote. With a click, the television on the wall flickered to life. It wasn't showing a movie. It was showing a live feed of the Arthur and Elaine Vance Literacy Center in town. It showed Leo standing in front of a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It showed the local mayor, the townspeople, and a large bronze plaque that read, "Funded by the estate of Elaine Vance, a legacy that cannot be sold." The money is gone, Elaine said, her voice gaining a sudden, terrifying strength. I've spent it. Every cent of the house money, the insurance, and the savings. I've funneled it into the foundation. It's an irrevocable trust. Even if you declared me insane this very second, you couldn't touch it. It's protected by a board of directors that doesn't include a single person named Vance. Mark's face went a sickly shade of gray. Julianne let out a strangled scream of pure rage. You bitch. You threw it all away. On books, on people you don't even know. I gave it to people who know how to read a story, Elaine said, stepping toward them. You too. You only knew how to read a balance sheet. And now, the balance is zero. The doctor looked at the siblings, then at the very clearly lucid and formidable woman in front of him. He closed his briefcase. I think there's been a mistake, he said quietly. She's not the one who's unwell. As the siblings stood there, their lives crumbling around them, the sheer weight of their betrayal began to settle into the room. They had come to collect a debt, only to find they were the ones who were bankrupt. The silence that followed Elaine's revelation was more than just a lack of sound. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a decade of lies finally collapsing. Julianne and Mark stood frozen in the center of the small cottage, their designer clothes and expensive jewelry looking like cheap costumes in the face of Elaine's raw, unbreakable dignity. They were no longer the powerful heirs apparent. They were small, hollowed-out people standing in the wreckage of their own greed. You can't do this, Mark whispered, his voice cracking. We're your children. We're your blood. You're leaving us with ... nothing. After everything we've been through. After everything you put me through. Elaine countered, her voice like a cold wind off the Pacific. You didn't see me as a mother. You saw me as an obstacle to your inheritance. You took my history and put a price tag on it. Well, I've done the same to you. I've put a price on your loyalty, and it turned out to be worth exactly zero. Julianne lunged toward the television, as if she could claw the money back from the images of the smiling children in the literacy center. I'll sue. I'll tell the world you're a bitter, vengeful old woman. I'll drag your name through the mud until that foundation is a laughingstock. Go ahead, Julianne, Elaine said, settling back into her chair and looking out at the waves. The cameras in this room have recorded every word of this encounter. They've recorded your threats, your rage, and the moment you realize the money was gone, if you sue, those videos become public record. The world won't see a bitter old woman, they'll see the reason why I did it. They'll see the children who sold their mother's soul for a minimalist aesthetic. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They were trapped, not by her, but by their own actions. They had spent years crafting a narrative that they were the saviors, and Elaine had just provided the ultimate plot twist with a final, desperate look at the woman who had once tucked them into bed and sang them to sleep. The siblings turned and fled the cottage. They didn't look back. They didn't say goodbye. They drove away from the coast of Oregon, heading back to lives that were now as empty as the house they had stripped years ago. In the aftermath, poetic justice in the months that followed, the fall of Julianne and Mark was swift and absolute. Without the promise of their mother's estate to leverage against their mounting debts, their world imploded. Mark was eventually barred from the tech industry after an investigation into his inheritance-backed loans revealed a pattern of fraud. Julianne lost her home to the bank. She ended up working a retail job in a strip mall, her days spent folding clothes that she could no longer afford to buy. Every time she looked at a customer's old family heirloom or a sentimental piece of jewelry, she felt a phantom ache in her chest, the weight of a cedar chest she had sold for a pittance. Elaine Vance passed away 6 months after the confrontation. She spent her final days in the literacy center, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the sound of people discovering the power of words. She was never alone. Leo and the other students became the family she had earned, rather than the one she was born into. When the news of her death broke, it didn't just appear in the local Oregon papers, it went viral. The digital time capsule was released as part of her will, a series of short videos titled The Price of a Memory. In them, Elaine didn't just talk about the items she lost. She talked about the importance of boundaries, the danger of entitlement, and the beauty of starting over when you think you have nothing left. The author and Elaine Vance Literacy Foundation grew into a national movement. It didn't just build libraries, it built history havens, places where families could store their digital and physical legacies for free, ensuring that no child would ever have the excuse to call a parent's life clutter. The final video in the capsule showed Elaine sitting on her porch in Oregon, the sunset painting her face in warm, golden hues. She looked directly into the camera, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "To whoever is watching this," she said softly, "values aren't what you own, they're what you're willing to protect. My children thought they were cleaning my life, but they were actually cleaning their own slates, seriousing the love I had for them until there was nothing left but the truth. If you're lucky enough to have people who love you, don't look at what they can give you in the future. Look at what they've already given you in the past. That's the only inheritance that matters." The screen faded to black, leaving the audience in a profound, reflective silence. Elaine Vance, the librarian who was treated like a ghost, had written the ultimate bestseller story of justice, heart, and the high cost of a hollow soul. The final lesson, as the credits roll on Elaine's story, we're left with a haunting question that echoes in the halls of our own lives. We live in a world obsessed with out with the old, in with the new, but at what point does decluttering become a betrayal of our own history? Elaine lost her belongings, but she found her power. Her children sought a fortune, but they found a mirror. In the end, poetic justice isn't about getting even. It's about the universe balancing the scales. Julianne and Mark wanted a life without the weight of the past, and they got exactly what they asked for. A future with no weight, no foundation, and no one to remember them. If you found yourself in Elaine's shoes, would you have been as cold as she was, or would you have given your children one last chance to make it right? Is blood really thicker than water, or is respect the only thing that keeps a family together? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear how you would have rewritten the ending. And if you enjoyed this cinematic journey into the heart of betrayal and justice, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have many more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss the next one.